Imagine the perfect holiday evening, a dazzling Christmas tree lighting, laughter in the air, and a family everyone admires. But beneath the glittering lights, a devastating secret unravels. A husband's betrayal, a nanny's chilling confession, and a mysterious murder. How far would someone go to keep the truth buried? Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking events that shattered this picture-perfect night forever. The town square of Willow Creek was alive with holiday cheer. Families gathered under the towering Christmas tree, adorned with twinkling lights and glittering ornaments. Children chased each other through the snow, their laughter mixing with the sounds of carolers singing festive tunes. It was the annual Christmas tree lighting ceremony, a beloved tradition that brought the small community together. Amid the festive bustle stood Emma, a woman who appeared to have it all. She smiled warmly as she held her children's hands, her husband James standing confidently by her side. Together, they seemed like the perfect family, a picture of harmony under the glow of the holiday lights. But beneath Emma's calm exterior, her mind churned with unease. Over the past months, subtle cracks had formed in the perfect image of her marriage. It began with the small things, James's late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, and the way he avoided her questions about their live-in nanny, Claire. Emma had been observant, quietly gathering pieces of a puzzle she hadn't wanted to assemble. But what truly broke her was the discovery of an old photo on James's phone. It showed Claire holding a child, a boy with striking features that mirrored James's. Emma had no doubt that the child was his. Tonight, Emma decided, the truth would come to light. She had spent weeks rehearsing the words that would expose James's betrayal in front of their closest friends and neighbors. She had chosen this night, not for revenge, but for clarity. Emma was done living a lie. As the countdown to the tree lighting drew near, Emma observed the scene around her. James moved easily through the crowd, shaking hands and sharing hearty laughs with townsfolk. His charm seemed effortless, but Emma noticed the slight tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes flickered toward Claire, who stood on the edge of the gathering, clutching a small boy's hand. Claire looked nervous, her gaze darting between James and Emma. She avoided meeting Emma's eyes, focusing instead on calming the boy, who was fidgeting with excitement. Emma couldn't help but feel a pang of anger as she watched Claire. It wasn't just betrayal that stung, it was the deceit, the careful effort to maintain the illusion of normalcy while a secret child stood just feet away from their family. Emma's grip tightened on the microphone she held, her palms sweaty despite the winter chill. The plan was simple: wait for the right moment, then step forward and speak. But as she watched James steal a glance at Claire, her heart raced. Something felt wrong. James's eyes were not just nervous, they were filled with a kind of dread that Emma hadn't noticed before. It was as if he were bracing for more than just her revelation. Across the square, Claire suddenly looked up, her face pale and stricken. Emma followed her gaze and saw a shadowed figure standing near the edge of the crowd. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and kept his distance from the festivities. His presence was unsettling, and Emma could see that Claire was visibly shaken. Who was he, and why did he seem to make Claire so afraid? The countdown began, and the crowd's cheers grew louder, but Emma's focus remained on James and Claire. Her carefully laid plan now felt fragile, as though something far more sinister lurked beneath the surface of the betrayal she had uncovered. The moment of truth was approaching, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the only one about to expose a secret. The crowd erupted into cheers as the towering Christmas tree came alive with a burst of shimmering lights, casting a golden glow over the snowy square. Emma barely registered the applause or the children's laughter as they marveled at the tree. Her eyes remained fixed on the man in the shadows. He lingered just beyond the reach of the festive light, his face obscured, but his presence felt heavy, almost menacing. Emma could sense the change in Claire's demeanor as well. The nanny clutched the boy tighter, her breath visible in short, panicked puffs against the cold air. James must have noticed him too. His confident charm was now a brittle shell, his eyes darting nervously between Claire and the man. It wasn't the typical unease of someone about to be caught in a lie. No, this was deeper. Fear, raw and unfiltered, etched across his features. For the first time, Emma wondered if she had underestimated just how dark and tangled James's secrets truly were. Emma's moment was supposed to come now. She had planned it all so carefully. But as she stepped forward, microphone in hand, her gaze flicked back to Claire, whose expression had shifted from nervous to outright terrified. Emma hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Something was wrong. Something much bigger than her revelation was brewing, and she could feel it tightening around her like a noose. The man moved closer, stepping into the edge of the crowd, where the soft glow of the Christmas lights illuminated his face. Emma didn't recognize him, but there was something in the sharp set of his jaw, the dark intensity of his gaze, that made her stomach twist. Claire's whispered plea to the boy, "Stay close to me," reached Emma's ears, and she saw the child cling to her leg, his innocent face peeking out at the man with a mixture of fear and curiosity. James stiffened, his smile frozen as he watched the man approach. He moved closer to Emma, placing a hand on her arm, but it wasn't comforting. It was a warning. "Not now," he murmured under his breath, his voice low and urgent. "Please, Emma, not here." Emma pulled her arm away, anger surging through her. She had planned to expose James for what he was, but this stranger had shaken her confidence. Who was he, and what role did he play in the secret James had worked so hard to bury? Before she could respond, a commotion broke out near the back of the square. A scream pierced the festive air, sharp and blood-curdling, silencing the crowd in an instant. All eyes turned toward the sound, but Emma's were fixed on James, who looked as though he had just seen a ghost. His face drained of color, and for a fleeting moment, Emma saw something she had never seen before: pure, unadulterated terror. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about her husband's betrayal anymore. Something much darker was unraveling, and Emma realized with chilling clarity that her night of truth-telling had just turned into something far more dangerous. The crowd began to murmur, their festive energy replaced by unease. Parents clutched their children closer, and neighbors exchanged worried glances. The scream had come from near the edge of the square, where the light of the Christmas tree faded into shadows. People craned their necks, trying to see what had caused the commotion, but there was no immediate answer. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the holiday music still playing through the speakers. Emma's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned toward the source of the noise, but her gaze was quickly drawn back to James, whose terror was impossible to ignore. He wasn't looking toward the sound. He wasn't scanning the crowd. His focus was singular, fixed on Claire and the man who now stood just feet away from her. The man leaned in toward Claire, his expression hard and unreadable. Emma couldn't hear what he said, but Claire's trembling lips and wide eyes told her everything she needed to know. This was no casual interaction. Claire clutched the child tighter, and for a moment Emma thought she might make a run for it. But the man stepped closer, his body blocking her path. "Who is he?" Emma whispered sharply to James. Her voice was low, but her fury was clear. She wasn't going to let him avoid her questions any longer. "What does he want?" James didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. His hand gripped his coat tightly, as though holding himself together, but his silence spoke volumes. He knew exactly who the man was, and the weight of that knowledge seemed to paralyze him. Suddenly, Claire's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. Her outburst drew the attention of the onlookers, who began to inch closer, curiosity overtaking caution. The man didn't move, but his posture grew more rigid. His shoulders squared as he stared down at her. Emma took a step forward, her instincts overriding her confusion. Whatever was happening, she wasn't going to stand by and let it unfold unchecked. But before she could reach them, the man stepped back, his hands raised slightly, a gesture of false surrender. His lips curled into a smirk, and he said something quietly to Claire that Emma couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it left Claire visibly shaken. The man turned and began to walk away, his steps slow and deliberate, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to thicken. Emma glanced at Claire, who was now on the verge of tears. Her hands trembled as she clutched the boy close, her gaze darting between James and the retreating figure. "What is going on?" Emma demanded, her voice rising with frustration. "Who is that man?" James finally turned to her, but his answer wasn't what she expected. "Not here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around the crowd, landing on Claire and the boy. "Not now." Before Emma could argue, another scream tore through the square. This one wasn't distant. It was close, too close. Emma spun toward the sound, her blood running cold. A woman near the back of the crowd staggered forward, her face pale and her hand clutching her mouth. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, shifting into panic. "What's happening?" someone shouted. Emma's stomach churned as she saw what the woman was pointing at. Lying on the ground, partially hidden behind a row of holiday decorations, was a figure, a lifeless body sprawled in the snow. Blood pooled around it, stark and vivid against the pristine white. The festive lights above seemed to mock the grim scene below, casting a warm glow over a moment that was anything but. Chaos erupted as the crowd surged forward, some trying to get a closer look, while others pulled their children away. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she caught a glimpse of the victim's face, and her entire world seemed to tilt. It was the man who had confronted Claire just moments ago, and now he was dead. The square dissolved into chaos, the once festive gathering unraveling into panic. Parents hurried their children away, shielding their eyes from the grim scene. Voices rose in confusion and fear, blending into a cacophony that made it hard for anyone to think clearly. Emma stood frozen, her eyes locked on the lifeless body of the man who had just confronted Claire. Blood seeped into the snow beneath him, the stark red standing out like a warning against the white purity of the winter setting. James grabbed Emma's arm, his grip tight and urgent. "We need to leave," he hissed, his voice trembling, but Emma didn't move. Her gaze darted to Claire, who was standing rigid, holding the boy so tightly that he began to squirm. Claire's face was ashen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, but her eyes, wide and terrified, were locked on James. Emma shook off James's hand, her anger boiling over. "No," she said firmly, stepping closer to Claire. "What is going on, James? Who was that man? Why does she look like she's seen a ghost?" Claire flinched at Emma's words, her grip on the child faltering. The boy whimpered, burying his face in Claire's shoulder. For a moment, Claire looked like she might speak, but James stepped forward, cutting her off. His voice was sharp, more desperate than authoritative. "Not here, Emma. This isn't the time." "It's never the time with you, is it?" Emma snapped, her voice rising. Her frustration mixed with the dread that was now curling in her stomach. First the lies, then the child you didn't think I'd figure out, and now this, a dead man. What else are you hiding? A few people in the crowd turned toward her outburst, their curiosity piqued by the escalating confrontation. James grabbed Emma's arm again, pulling her aside with more force than before. "Emma, stop," he said, his tone low but frantic. "You don't understand what's happening." "Then explain it to me," she shot back, her voice trembling. "Because right now, all I see is a man you clearly knew lying dead in the snow, and you're acting like you expected this to happen." James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Claire's shaky voice interrupted. "It's not his fault." Her words were barely audible, but they cut through the noise like a knife. Both Emma and James turned to her, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her voice softening but her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to Claire. "What's not his fault?" Claire shook her head, her tears falling faster now. She hugged the boy tighter, her whole body trembling. "He didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He didn't want it to go this far." Emma's stomach churned as she pieced together Claire's words. "You're saying he knew this man? That James—" Her voice caught in her throat. "Claire, what aren't you telling me?" Before Claire could answer, the sound of sirens pierced the air, drawing the crowd's attention. Blue and red lights flashed in the distance as police vehicles sped toward the square. The commotion grew louder, people stepping back to make way for the approaching officers. Emma turned back to Claire, but whatever fragile resolve the nanny had summoned seemed to vanish. She shook her head again, looking at James with a mixture of fear and pleading. "Don't," she mouthed silently to him, her eyes brimming with desperation. The police arrived, their presence commanding immediate attention. Officers moved quickly to secure the scene, ushering the crowd back and taping off the area around the body. Emma watched as James's posture stiffened, his shoulders tense and his jaw clenched. He was no longer the charming, composed man she had known. He looked like a cornered animal, caught in a trap of his own making. As the officers began questioning those closest to the scene, one of them approached James. "Sir," the officer said, his tone professional but firm, "we need to ask you a few questions." Emma felt her breath catch as she watched James's face pale even further. He glanced at her, then at Claire, who stood silently, her eyes red and swollen. The officer's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emma realized in that moment that whatever answer she sought, she wasn't the only one demanding them now, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what the truth would reveal. The square was quieter now, the holiday cheer completely replaced by the somber weight of police presence. The crowd had thinned, with only a few lingering witnesses and curious onlookers staying behind the yellow tape. Emma stood frozen, her breath visible in the cold air, as the officer led James toward a nearby patrol car. His face was a mask of composure, but Emma could see the cracks. The slight tremor in his hands, the tight set of his jaw, the darting glances he cast toward Claire, and the lifeless body in the snow. Another officer approached Claire, his expression gentle but firm. "Ma'am," he said, "we need to ask you a few questions. Would you please come with me?" Claire flinched, clutching the boy tightly to her chest. He's just a child," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I don't want him to—" "We'll make sure he's taken care of," the officer assured her. "But we need your statement." Emma stepped forward, her protective instincts overriding her confusion and anger. "I'll stay with her," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the cold air. "She shouldn't be alone." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "All right, you can both come to the station." Claire looked at Emma with wide, tear-filled eyes, and for the first time that night, Emma saw something she hadn't expected: gratitude. Claire gave a shaky nod, allowing the officer to guide her toward a separate car. Emma followed closely, her thoughts racing. At the police station, the tension was palpable. Emma and Claire were seated in a small, dimly lit room, the sterile walls doing nothing to ease the weight of the situation. Claire sat hunched over, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, while Emma leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Across the hall, Emma could see James being led into another room. He glanced at her through the glass, his expression a mixture of fear and warning. Two detectives entered the room, their expressions neutral but their eyes sharp. The older one introduced himself as Detective Harris, his deep voice steady and calm. The younger detective, a woman named Detective Alvarez, set a notepad on the table and gave Claire an encouraging nod. "Miss Claire," Harris began, his tone professional but not unkind. "We need you to tell us everything you know about the man who was found tonight. Who he is, how you know him, and why he was at the event." Claire's hands trembled in her lap, and Emma reached over, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay," Emma said softly. "You need to tell them the truth." Claire swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "His name is Mark," she began, her words halting. "Mark Fletcher. I didn't want him to be there. He wasn't supposed to come." "And who is Mark Fletcher to you?" Alvarez asked, her tone patient but probing. Claire hesitated, her lips trembling. She looked at Emma, then at her lap. He's someone I knew before I worked for the family," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Before I moved here." Emma's stomach twisted. "You knew him before?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Claire, what does that mean?" Claire's eyes filled with tears and she nodded. "He was connected to James," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "James hired him to—" Her voice faltered and she buried her face in her hands. "To do what?" Harris pressed, leaning forward slightly. "To handle things," Claire whispered, her voice muffled. "When I found out I was pregnant, James didn't want anyone to know. He paid Mark to keep me quiet." Emma's heart sank, the weight of Claire's confession hitting her like a blow. She opened her mouth to speak, but Claire wasn't finished. "But then something changed," Claire said, looking up with tear-streaked cheeks. "Mark came back into my life months later. He said he needed money. More money. He threatened to tell everyone if James didn't pay him. I didn't know what to do. I told him to stay away, but he kept coming back." Alvarez scribbled notes furiously, her pen scratching against the notepad. "And tonight?" she asked. "Why was he there?" Claire's hands gripped the edge of the table. "I think he wanted to confront James," she said, her voice trembling. "He wanted the money. He said he wouldn't leave until he got what he deserved. But I didn't know it would end like this. I swear, I didn't know." Emma sat back, her mind reeling. She looked at Claire, whose face was etched with fear and guilt, and then at the detectives, who exchanged a brief glance. Whatever dark secret had brought Mark to the square tonight, it was clear that this story was far from over, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that James wasn't just a bystander in this tragedy. While Claire's trembling confession hung heavy in the air, Emma's thoughts turned to James. Across the hall, she could see him pacing in the interrogation room, his movements erratic. His polished veneer had cracked wide open, revealing a man consumed by desperation. Emma couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. James wasn't just complicit in what had happened tonight. He was central to it. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on Claire. "So, Mark Fletcher was blackmailing James," he said, his voice steady. "But that still doesn't explain why he's dead. Did James ever indicate he might do something drastic to silence him?" Claire shook her head violently, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "No. James didn't want anyone to know about Mark. He wanted this to go away quietly. That's why he paid him in the first place." Her voice cracked as she added, "I didn't think he'd ever kill him." Emma's stomach twisted at the word, the stark finality of it. She didn't know what was worse, the idea that James might have orchestrated Mark's death, or the gnawing realization that she didn't know the man she had married at all. Detective Alvarez slid a photograph across the table, its glossy surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. It was a picture of Mark Fletcher taken from security footage earlier that evening. You said Mark was there to confront James, but according to witnesses, he spent most of the event watching you. Why? Claire's gaze dropped to her lap, and for a long moment, she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Because he didn't trust me, she admitted. He thought I might tell Emma everything. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. Emma's hands tightened into fists on the table. So you knew, she said, her voice low and trembling. You knew all of it. The affair, the blackmail, everything, and you stayed. I didn't have a choice, Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. James said he'd ruin me if I told anyone. He promised me he'd handle it. I didn't know it would get this far. Emma stared at her, a mixture of anger and pity warring within her. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but deep down, she knew that Claire wasn't the only one who had been trapped by James's lies. As the detectives pieced together Claire's testimony, a knock on the door interrupted the tense silence. A young officer stepped in, holding a tablet in his hand. "Detectives," he said, his voice steady. "You're going to want to see this." Harris and Alvarez exchanged a glance before taking the tablet. They huddled over the screen, their brows furrowing as they reviewed the footage. Emma strained to see, but the screen was angled away from her. After a moment, Alvarez's head snapped up, her expression sharp. "This changes everything," she muttered. "What is it?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "What are you looking at?" Harris turned the tablet toward Emma and Claire, revealing the footage from one of the surveillance cameras near the square. It showed Mark Fletcher walking toward the Christmas tree, his face set in determination. But what caught Emma's attention wasn't Mark. It was the figure following him at a careful distance. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat and hat that obscured most of his features. He kept his head low, his movements deliberate. The footage was grainy, but it was clear he wasn't just a passerby. He was watching Mark. "Who is that?" Emma asked, her pulse quickening. "That's what we need to find out," Alvarez said. "This man followed Mark to the square, stayed close during the event, and disappeared moments after the murder." Harris leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Claire. "Do you recognize him? Has Mark ever mentioned anyone like this?" Claire stared at the screen, her face pale. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've never seen him before." But Emma wasn't convinced. There was something in Claire's eyes, a flicker of recognition she was trying to suppress. Emma's mind raced as she considered the possibilities. Was Claire hiding something, or was this man another piece of the tangled web James had woven? The detectives exchanged a look, their expressions grim. "We'll run this through facial recognition," Harris said, turning to the young officer. "Get it out to the team immediately." As the officer left, Emma felt a cold weight settle in her chest. The truth was closer now, but it wasn't just James's lies unraveling. It was the entire story. Someone else was pulling the strings, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The hours stretched on in the police station, the festive glow of the Christmas lights outside, now a distant memory. Emma sat in a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, her mind a storm of unanswered questions. James was still in the interrogation room, and Claire had been taken to a separate space for further questioning. Emma's thoughts kept circling back to the shadowy figure from the surveillance footage. Who was he, and what was his role in this nightmare? Detective Alvarez returned, her face etched with focus as she approached Emma. "We've identified the man from the footage," she said, holding a file in her hand. "His name is Daniel Ward. Does that name mean anything to you?" Emma shook her head. The name unfamiliar, but it sparked something in the recesses of her memory. She struggled to place it, but nothing came to mind. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice tight. Alvarez opened the file, flipping through its contents. Ward has a criminal record, fraud, extortion, and some suspected involvement in violent crimes, though nothing ever stuck. He's known for working in the shadows, often as a fixer for people looking to make their problems disappear. Emma's heart sank. The description matched the situation perfectly. "So James hired him too?" she asked bitterly, the edges of her voice sharp with anger. "That's what we're trying to determine," Alvarez said. "But there's something else." She hesitated, her brow furrowing. Ward and Mark Fletcher had a connection. They worked together several years ago in a similar extortion scheme. The revelation hit Emma like a punch to the gut. "So Mark wasn't just some random blackmailer," she said, her voice shaking. "He was part of something bigger." Alvarez nodded grimly. "It looks that way. Ward could have been involved from the start, or he may have come back into the picture later. Either way, this is no longer just about James's affair or Mark's blackmail. This is about a much larger network of people, and it's clear they didn't all trust each other." Emma's mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. The shadowy figure watching Mark, Claire's terror, James's desperation, it all pointed to a web of deceit far more complex than she had imagined. But one question remained. Who killed Mark Fletcher? "Where is Ward now?" Emma asked, her voice tight with urgency. "That's the problem," Alvarez admitted. "He's gone. The cameras lost him after he left the square, and he hasn't turned up anywhere else. But we have officers tracking his last known location. If he's involved, we'll find him." Emma exhaled sharply, frustration building in her chest. "And James?" she asked. "What's he said about any of this?" Alvarez hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He's not talking," she said finally, "but he's not denying his connection to Fletcher or the payments. He's scared, Emma, and that tells us one thing. He knows more than he's letting on." Emma stood abruptly, pacing the small waiting area. The image of Ward lingering in the shadows played on repeat in her mind, his deliberate movements and unsettling presence haunting her. "James is hiding something," she said, more to herself than to Alvarez. "And I'm going to find out what it is." Alvarez placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You've already helped us more than you realize," she said. "But this is dangerous territory. If Ward's involved, this isn't just a family scandal anymore. It's something much darker." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she was determined to see it through. For the first time, she realized that the answers she sought weren't just about James's betrayal. They were about uncovering the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The night deepened, and the weight of the investigation pressed harder on Emma. She sat alone in the cold waiting area, her thoughts racing. Across the hall, James finally emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by 2 officers. His shoulders sagged, his confident demeanor now replaced by a look of utter defeat. Emma rose instinctively, her hands trembling as she faced him. "What did you tell them?" she asked, her voice low but steady. James avoided her gaze, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Enough," he said quietly, but the crack in his voice betrayed his fear. "But it's not over, Emma. Ward, he's more dangerous than you realize." Before Emma could press further, Detective Alvarez appeared, her expression grave. "We've tracked Ward to a location on the outskirts of town," she said. "A warehouse. It looks like he might be hiding there. We're moving in now." Emma's pulse quickened as the pieces of the night fell into sharper focus. The dead man in the square, the surveillance footage, and now this. Ward wasn't just a shadowy figure. He was the key to everything. "Are you arresting him?" Emma asked. her voice tinged with both hope and dread. "We're bringing him in," Alvarez confirmed, "but we're prepared for resistance. Ward's not the kind of man to go quietly." The warehouse loomed large and foreboding in the dark, its broken windows and rusted exterior a stark contrast to the holiday lights still glowing faintly in the distance. The police surrounded the building, their flashlights cutting through the cold night air. Emma had insisted on coming, refusing to stay behind when the truth was so close. Inside, the officers found Ward. He was calm, eerily so, sitting at a table littered with papers and an empty glass of whiskey. He didn't flinch as they approached, his hands raised in a mockery of surrender. "Took you long enough," he muttered, his voice cold and sharp. Ward's arrogance crumbled, however, when Alvarez placed a photo of Mark Fletcher in front of him. His smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he leaned back in his chair. "What about him?" he asked, though his tone betrayed his unease. "We know you followed Fletcher to the square," Alvarez said firmly. "We have footage placing you there minutes before his death. So, tell us, Ward, what happened?" Ward's laughter was a harsh sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. "What happened?" he repeated, shaking his head. "Fletcher got greedy. He thought he could play both sides, but he underestimated how far James was willing to go to protect his secrets." Emma's breath hitched at the mention of James. She stepped forward, unable to hold back any longer. "What did James do?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What aren't you telling us?" Ward's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment she saw something she hadn't expected: pity. "James didn't pull the trigger," Ward said, his voice almost gentle. "But he made it happen. Fletcher was leverage, and when he stopped being useful, James made sure someone else cleaned up the mess." Emma's knees buckled, and she leaned against the wall for support. The weight of Ward's words crushed the last of her illusions. James might not have committed the murder himself, but his hands were just as dirty. He had orchestrated everything, ensuring that Mark Fletcher would never reveal his secrets. "Who killed him?" Alvarez pressed, her voice sharp. Ward shrugged, his smirk returning. "Let's just say Fletcher wasn't as careful as he thought. He pissed off the wrong people, and I was just the one who made sure it all went down smoothly." The room fell silent, the gravity of Ward's admission settling like a heavy fog. Emma turned away, tears streaming down her face. She had come looking for the truth, but it had destroyed everything she thought she knew. Days later, James was arrested for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The town of Willow Creek, once a haven of warmth and community, was left reeling from the scandal. Mark Fletcher's murder had unearthed a web of deceit, blackmail, and betrayal that stained the idyllic image of the town forever. Claire, shaken but free from the shadow of James's control, moved away with her son, hoping to start anew. Emma stayed behind, determined to rebuild her life from the ashes of the lies that had consumed it. She filed for divorce, vowing never to let someone else's darkness consume her again. As the snow fell softly over the now quiet square, Emma stood by the darkened Christmas tree, a stark contrast to the night it had shone so brightly. The truth had come to light, but it had left scars that would take a lifetime to heal. And though the town would move on, Emma knew she would never forget the darkness that had lurked just beyond the glow of the holiday lights. The truth, no matter how painful or buried, will always find its way to the surface. It teaches us that lies and betrayal may offer temporary protection, but they inevitably lead to greater destruction, not just for the perpetrator, but for everyone involved. The story also underscores the importance of accountability. When people avoid responsibility for their actions, it creates a ripple effect that hurts innocent lives. Finally, it reminds viewers that facing the truth, no matter how difficult, is always better than living in the shadows of deceit. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it can be nearly impossible to rebuild.